Welcome, everyone, to the first of a series of readings, which will take us through a book that's very close to my heart. It's something which I've had the privilege of reading several times, and each time I read it, there's new things that I'm discovering. It's probably one of the most important, dense pieces of philosophy that has been written in the modern times, which I think more people should be introduced to. And this what I'm talking about is a book entitled The Science of Christian Economy and Other Prison Writings by an author, the late physical economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, which was written in 1991. I mentioned it says prison writings. So for those who are listening at home, or I think everyone here is aware, but for those listening at home, Lyndon LaRouche is a very, very fascinating figure of modern times. He recently passed away in 2019 in February. And at a certain point, him and the organization that he put into motion in the 1970s started gaining a lot of influence throughout the 1980s. Members of the organization were running for Congress, were actually winning seats in different states of the USA. Various governments were beginning to listen very carefully to the policy proposals of Mr. LaRouche, including governments in India, Mexico, the Middle East and beyond, including Ronald Reagan as well on the Strategic Defense Initiative, took on LaRouche's advice as a back channel to break away to destroy the whole Cold War mutually assured destruction system that had really dominated the entire Cold War, that was pitted around the premise of a balance of terror, of nuclear annihilation. So the idea of a Strategic Defense Initiative, of transforming all of these weapons of destruction into weapons of defense, with US and Soviet allies working together to co-control this system, was something that was announced by Ronald Reagan in 1983. This was a brainchild of Mr. LaRouche himself. And he was a back channel diplomat of sorts, unofficially, between the Soviets and the US side of things. So at a certain point in the late 80s, certain very powerful figures associated with Henry Kissinger, Robert Mueller, the figure who many people now only know because of his role in steering the color revolution inside of the USA against Trump in recent years. Robert Mueller was a point man in the takedown of LaRouche at that point in his organization in the late 80s, where basically you had, books have been written on this, but it was a sham trial with sham evidence, with accusations of people and members of his organization of conspiring to conspire against the US government. And basically people were railroaded into prison and given crazy sentences. Mike Billington, whose paper we just finished reading on the deconstructionist assault of China, was given something like a 100-year sentence. It was wild. Mr. LaRouche, already late into his 60s at that time, was given a 15-year sentence, hard labor, and that was something he was not meant to come out of. So at the time, it was really presumed that he was not necessarily going to survive the prison experience, and he wrote down for posterity the method of thinking that he found to be the most fruitful in what he was doing when he was coming through his discoveries of the 1950s and 60s in the science of physical economy, that allowed him to develop an approach to thinking about human economy, not from the standpoint of statistical number games or monetary theory, which is why most official economists are wrong in all of their forecasts about where the economy is going, because they're just looking at trends of monetary figures on Wall Street, layouts or other things like that, but that don't have any bearing on the real parameters shaping human civilization, right? Which is a science. And it's a science that's not, people would say, oh, but that's anti-creative. If you say that economics is a science, that means you don't allow for freedom or individuality or spontaneity or creativity, because a science is all about deterministic formulas. And that people who think that way are betraying really the fact that they don't know what real science is, because science is not, it uses formulas, it uses deductive and inductive reasoning. That's true. These are tools that are part of what the mind does, but that's not all the mind does. Because the human economy and human beings and our experience is more than just our logical side of things. It's also about our passion, our hopes, our aspirations, our creative power to make leaps that are nonlinear into discovery concepts. and then to translate those into ways that benefit both ourselves in the immediate world that we live in, but also into the future world that doesn't exist yet, that we want to bring into being. So this is something which in many ways the oligarchy understands on a certain level, but at the same time as they understand that, they recognize that if this were given the right to express itself, as it almost has done in many instances of human history, going back to, the period of John F. Kennedy's approach to try to create a system of win-win cooperation amongst nations cooperating on mutual development, or before that with Franklin Roosevelt's program with his allies around the world to create a world of win-win cooperation after World War II, or even with Lincoln's allies before that. And this goes back all the way to the times of ancient times, really. An effort to really create a society where everybody becomes philosopher. Every citizen has access to their philosophical powers, and all of the leaders have access to those powers as well. This is the idea of Plato's philosopher king, that society can only break the cycle of going from mob democracy and anarchy to tyranny cyclically forever, and that will only be broken when citizens become philosophers or kings become philosophers. But the point is, you have to have true philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, and not just the ability to use ideas to persuade and manipulate your enemies to abide by your will, which is what a lot of the current Nietzschean technocrats running or trying to run the world think philosophy is. So anyway, without further ado, I think everyone had a chance to either pick up a copy physically or purchase the online digital version. I also picked up a digital version too on Kindle, which we will use. For those who don't have it, if you are watching this online on YouTube and you'd like to follow along, I suggest going to the description in this YouTube video. There's a description box, and there is a free book on Google Play, which Kim just discovered. So that's something you can get even for free. The Kindle version is $10. I think the hard copies are about $20 or $30 or something. There's 3 books compiled in here. I forgot to mention this, but the book that we're going to read today, or we'll start reading today, is called In Defense of Common Sense. Then there's something called Project A, which hopefully we'll be able to read maybe in a couple of weeks' time. And after that, the third and final book is The Science of Christian Economy. And each one is broken up into small chapters. They're bite-sized, very dense ideas, like I said. They're worth going back to and rereading and rediscovering a lot of these concepts and working through on our own. And importantly, too, I'll just say there's a lot of references to things you may not know about already. He might reference dialogues of Plato or something about a 19th century physicist who you didn't even know about, maybe you knew as a name, and a work that they might have written. We're not going to read all of the associated references all at the same time, but just take note of what these things are. You can then, as you build up your list of names and references, these are things that you're going to want to put on your priority list of reading on your own as we craft out our personal curriculum for development. So just take note of those names, and they will be referenced back again and again as we proceed. And their writings are discoverable online, or if they're difficult to find, you can go to the Rising Tide Foundation website, and we have a whole list of original writings of every great thinker, or as many great thinkers as we could compile with in alphabetical order. So that's something that's there too. So without further ado, since we're doing this for an audience that will be listening on YouTube, I would only say that if you are not comfortable reading aloud, don't feel obliged to necessarily read aloud. We're going to take turns reading, maybe one chapter each person. If you just want to listen, stop and pose a question or something like that, feel free to do that. Or if you have a thought that he says, that if he says something that's powerful, that it inspires a thought that you want to share, do that too. But we want to have as many people who are just comfortable reading, and that way when people are listening, driving to work or something, it's as smooth as possible. So just keep that in mind. So if I call upon you and you're not comfortable necessarily reading, don't worry about it. So who wants to begin? Let me just do the screen share here. Here we are. Share. Okay. Can everyone see the screen right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Let me just see here. A second. Of course. Okay. All right. Now the only problem is I'm not figuring out how to go from page to page.
Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to jump straight into what is common sense. So this is in defense of common sense. So who would like to begin the reading here?
I will.
All right.
If that's all right with everyone.
I don't protest.
What is common sense? Perhaps there is some truth in the old saw that the grass is always greener in the other fellow's yard. During my 66 odd years, the people who praised common sense the longest and loudest turned out to be fellows who possessed very little of that particular virtue. The rest among us, watching those performances, were ashamed to defend common sense by its true name. Now, it appears sometimes that common sense has about the same prospects as did the extinct dodo. This occasion appears to be our last opportunity to save it, before our nation, too, might become extinct. Let us now, at last, defend it openly by its true name. To that end, let us construct agreement to a proper definition. We begin with two simple decisions. We should have no reluctance at throwing out all connotations of horse sense. The image of cleaning our living room carpets with a pitchfork improves our resolution on that account. It should be obvious that we must reject all definitions premised axiomatically upon the notion of an individual person with the brains to survive. Societies may or may not be immortal. No individual is. We require a definition which points not only toward the preconditions for successful survival of entire societies. This must be a definition which includes a proof that some quality possessed by at least some persons within the deliberative processes of that society is indispensable to make possible the successful survival of that society as a whole. Is survival itself not success? There exist states of social existence which must appear to be momentary survival, but which are also a step upward along a pathway which leads but to ruin over the longer term. Whatever common sense should mean, the included term common signifies that a society were unlikely to attain successful survival unless common sense were more or less commonplace. That is a view not inconsistent with an opinion expressed by some notable founders of our Federal Republic, that a certain quality of universal public education were indispensable to ensure future generations capable of preserving the freedoms which had then been won recently at such great peril and expense. Such are the broadest generalizations, the guidelines which must circumscribe our continuing search for an adequate definition of true common sense. First, we must focus upon the subject of the successful survival of an entire society. Within that frame of reference, we must define that essential quality of the individual without the which the society as a whole could not survive.
Good. I was just thinking about Iraq's recent decision to break out of its agreement with China on the oil for reconstruction.
Right, yeah.
Policy. And they had this amazing deal with China from last year where they agreed that the oil sales would go into a fund, and then that fund would then at a certain point be multiplied by China by like tenfold to like, you know, become a whatever it is, $10 billion. And then that fund would then be invested in infrastructure for the reconstruction of Iraq. And now the new Iraqi government that's been put in place that's more malleable after the last one, Maliki was taken out. The new one basically said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore because price of oil just increased quite a bit. So we can like meet our needs much more effectively now by selling our oil and not going along with the Chinese long-term plan. And it's like, you might think that you have momentary self-interest that you just guaranteed for yourself because you're going to get more money in the immediate term, but you've just sabotaged your future by going along with that.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a perfect example, actually. As a nation state, defying common sense, yeah. It's like, yeah.
It's another, maybe that could be an exercise people could think of for next week. What is one or two case studies of successful survival versus, or how has cases of successful survival been sabotaged in favor of choices of short-term apparent survival, which actually destroyed you in the future? So what are cases in history or in the present that we could think of that would satisfy that criteria? Like, be a good way to get the mind working.
Yeah, I mean, we even do that in the past, don't we? Like, if you take the subject of justice, you could say Assange, like the kind of ruling around that was, you know, in that sense, and that the judge kind of did it on these grounds that weren't really like consistent with what he was actually being charged with, you know. So like they're talking about like the worry of him dying in America and stuff like this. And yeah, it has like a double meaning.
So let's do this next week. Let's contribute a thought of an example of that, either in the present or in the past, on examples of successful versus not successful survival. Okay, so number 2, chapter 2. Nick, since that was a short chapter of just 2 pages, why don't you read one more chapter, and then we could have each person doing two chapters.
Sweet. A swimmer is rescued from the sea moments before his strength had ebbed fatally. This is momentary survival. Is this a paradigm for the successful survival of an entire society? How must we distinguish between merely momentary and durable survival? What has gone before now generates what follows. Select some moment of a continuing process of survival of the society as a whole. This process is the aggregation and interaction of the deaths, maturations, births, and conceptions, which together define a collection of individuals functionally as an indivisible whole. That selected moment serves as a time of departure for a continuing journey into the future. Assign the label A to that moment. To each of a series of selected subsequent moments of that continuing journey, assign respectively the labels B, C, D, and so on. Does the swimmer's survival at moment B portend a likelihood for his continuing survival through C, D, and so on? Perhaps to foster a successful posterity? Such is the raw distinction between momentary and successful survival. Regard that journey into the future as if it were a kind of mathematical physicist's continuous function. Continuously cause generates effect, and effect has a causal relationship to the subsequent effects. This function is expressed in terms of increase or decrease of a magnitude termed potential population density. This is no ordinary or linear sort of continuous function. It is non-linear, but not the less an efficiently continuous function in experimental terms of reference. We shall come to that in due course here, after we have examined population density and potential population density. Population density signifies what the very term must appear to imply. It signifies, most loosely, the number of persons inhabiting an average square kilometre of land area. On closer inspection, this simple ratio becomes more and more interesting. Some anthropologists teach that, once upon a time, when the surface of our planet was still a utopian wilderness, all mankind lived in a state of infantile innocence and harmony with nature, called a simple hunting and gathering society. There is no surviving evidence to support the alleged existence of such a primitive society, although numerous cases are known in which failed societies have been collapsed into a condition resembling the utopian ideal. Whether such states of society's development occur only as the next to lowest degree of degeneration of a culture, or might also have come into existence as a moment in an upward trend of society's development, is not a relevant issue, beyond our mere obligation to note that as a fact. For such a state of society, the demographic and related economic characteristics are known within fairly good degrees of estimation. One estimate of a population density is 10 square kilometers of average wilderness land area per person. Otherwise, the utopian hunting and gathering society resembles a tribe of baboons or yahoos. The post-infancy life expectancy is significantly less than an average of 20 years. One estimate for the upper limit to the Earth's population in such a utopia would be about 10 million persons. In contrast, today there are more than 5 billion persons. Had the world as a whole employed, to the degree it might have done so, the levels of technology already available by 1970, not only would the planet's population be significantly larger than it is, the average standard of living per capita would approximate that of North America in 1970, and the potential population as distinct from the actual would be approaching 25 billion. Whoa. The increase of both the actual and the potential population densities during the recent thousands of years is the outcome of the continued and interdependent generation, transmission, and efficient assimilation of scientific and technological progress. This signifies that the transformation of land and productive powers of labor, which reflect directly the causal impact of scientific progress per se, has the following qualities of impact upon potential population density. Number one, the fertility of the land for production and for human habitation is increased. Two, the physical productivity of labor is increased. Three, the per capita physical standard of living of labor's households, market basket is improved. The amount of average land area required to sustain an average person is reduced, while the required and realized standard of physical consumption is increased. We discover also that the following changes occur as well, with the rise in the potential physical productivity of labor and the correlated rise in required per capita consumption. The following trends prevail. 4. The amount of power consumed per capita and per hectare increases. 5. The amount of power concentrated upon a cross-section of work area tends to be increased. Also, the following social changes correlate with increases in physical productivity. Number 6. The ratio of urban to rural population increases toward what seems to be an asymptotic upper limit. 7. The ratio of labor employed in production of producers' goods relative to labor employed in production of households and related goods rises. These changes proceed with the restriction that the per hectare and per capita output of rural and of households and related goods rises and never declines. These preconditions are associated with other demographic changes. 8. The age of maturation, e.g., full entry into the regular labor force, rises toward apparently an asymptotic upper limit. Number 9. There is a general trend of shift from labor-intensive to power-intensive modes of employment of operatives engaged in physical output. To survive successfully signifies satisfying all these preconditions. These preconditions determine the causal connection between advances in technology and increases in potential population density.
If somebody has not heard a lot of these concepts before, don't get intimidated by a lot of these ideas. There's actually a really good documentary, which I'll include in the description of this video, called The Power of Labor, which is a 2-hour lecture by LaRouche himself in 1985, going through a lot of these concepts in more detail. The key thing to keep in mind are the variables of real population and potential population, right? What you have as a population on the earth and what you potentially could support, which changes at varying degrees based upon this question of technological progress that you're applying or not applying, withholding from society, right? And constraints and pressures that will occur from that standpoint. So if you have those thoughts in mind, then you'll be able to think about each of these 9 points as we explore this question of real successful survival versus fictitious survival or momentary survival.
Mm-hmm. Consider the series A, B, C, D, onwards to Z. In this light, assign to each term a specific moment of human development, and also assign to that term the appropriate estimate of potential population density. To console the anthropologist among us, let us assign to A time in imaginary prehistory, once upon a time, where we find his simple hunting and gathering utopia. We have, somewhere in later parts of the series, real history of real societies, such moments as Athens, 599 BC, Western Europe in the moment of Charlemagne's 1742 AD to 1814 census, Italy, 1439 AD, England, 1588 AD, France, 1672 AD, France, 1776 AD, USA, 1866 AD, USA, 1946 AD, and so on. Each term of that series represents for humanity as a whole a relatively higher value of implicit potential population density than any preceding term. The question implicitly is, does an advance in potential at B cause a further advance appearing at C, D, and so on? If there is some causal necessity linking the occurrence of a relatively higher potential at moment N to a still greater potential at a later moment N, and this is also true of the causal bearing of N upon later moment Q, Q upon P, and so forth, then the increase of potential at N implicitly causes the increases at N, Q, P, and so forth. That is a crude paradigm for successful survival of an entire society. This is no ordinary sort of algebraic function. Now, as we turn next to our first relevant glimpse into the deep interior of the individual human mind, we shall encounter a proof. Why only non-algebraic geometric numbers can enable us to reflect potential population density as we have represented that magnitude thus far.
Said this is dense. All right. Any
Yeah.
thoughts before we proceed to chapter 3?
It's so dense.
Thoughts, questions, or anything, or should we just read on to part 3? Part 3 it is.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of
Yeah,
because like this is something interesting. Like he talks in this way, which is like at one moment very like abstract, you know. But then like so he talks about the A, B, C, D, and he puts it into that. But then later on he gives us these historical references.
Mm-hmm.
And so like yeah, I've always found that useful, like to think about like these really important moments of history and how the outcomes could have potentially been greater or like different, and how those effects would have, you know, gone on to possibly defeat the oligarchy to a greater margin and you know, bring about worldwide development on a greater scale. So yeah, it's really nice how he does that. Like he gives you actual examples right there.
Yeah, and he can, they're sort of seen as homework in a sense too. Like if you want to take the initiative, he's basically saying that you could take these periods of Charlemagne's census at this moment in time, or Italy at this moment, and you could look at, well, what was the population of those times, and could you figure out, based upon certain parameters of agricultural potential and other things, what were the potential populations of those days? That were they increasing or were they decreasing? Apparently they were increasing, and you could sort of zero in as a student on what were the factors allowing for that increase of potential, as well as of the real population, right? So yeah, there's sort of challenges for, you could see somebody building a university curriculum around these sorts of
Yeah.
assignments and building a training for real economists to grow out of, instead of just what we have coming out of business school.
I mean, he tried, right, to do something like a university or yeah.
Yeah, that got crushed, like I said, when the FBI and the Kissinger networks came down in the organization, and he ended up in prison with many of his associates. A lot of the initiatives to set up an actual academy of sorts was subverted, as far as I understand, in the 80s. So anyway, the ideas are still true, and second chances still exist. So I don't know, Jerry, do you want to read?
Yep, okay.
Awesome.
3, potential population density. So far, until the onset of the 1970s, virtually no sane literate member of our Western European cultural heritage would have required an explanation of the manner we have referenced, the causal correlation between scientific and technological progress as proximate cause and increase of momentary potential population density as effect. We cannot leave matters so. The manner in which we define potential population density, not as merely momentary, but successful survival, has changed everything. Before we define the function for successful survival, there are 2 subtopics which must be examined. The first is the deeper meaning of scientific and technological progress. After that, we examine the fact that all true natural law must be coherent with the central feature of non-algebraic geometric function, isochronicity. The simple fact respecting technological progress is that no species of beast can affect such behavior. Scientific and technological progress reflects a quality of the human individual which sets mankind apart from and above all other living creatures. In all beasts, the range of behavioral change which can be generated on behalf of the species from within the species itself is delimited in effective range, as if by fixed instinct. This is to the effect that the potential population density of the species may be altered either locally or generally by changes introduced to the beast's environment, but the beast cannot significantly improve that potential willfully. Since we are examining this unique quality of the human species' behavior from the standpoint of a continuous function in mathematical physics, it is appropriate that we define scientific progress as a class of mathematical event. At the instant we resolve to do that, the fun begins. No formalist system of mathematics, that is, no mathematics in the spirit of deductive logic, can represent even the simplest kind of act of scientific discovery. See Appendix 4. Therefore, deductive logic is useless as a way of representing human mental life. However, by showing what deductive logic cannot do, we are able to see more clearly what occurs in every genuine scientific or analogous creative act of the human mind. At first glance, population density is a simple ratio, a countable number of persons to a countable number of square kilometers of inhabited land area. This might be admired as a way of representing some useful ideas bearing upon momentary survival at moment B. But it is useless as a term when our attention is turned to successful survival, the imputed values of each and all of B, C, D, etc. at moment B. In a related example, John von Neumann's systems of linear inequalities might appear to be applied successfully to estimating potential population densities in animal ecologies. Those mathematical methods are worse than useless for human ecologies. The paramount difficulty in both instances is human mental behavior, the role of scientific and technological progress as a causal principle in generating increase of potential population density as an effect. In effect, a direction of scientific and technological progress causes a trend of increase of potential population density. We examine the construction of an intelligible representation of this continuous function. This function, whose construction we are to examine in broad terms here, is characteristic of all human behavior which is associated with successful survival. It is not operative in any form of animal behavior. The general form of the function is given thus. 1. Technological progress fosters a rise in potential population density. 2. A rise in potential population density, so caused, fosters the conditions for an advance in the technological level of generalized practice. 3. That, if realized, fosters a further increase of potential population density. The foregoing presumes a fulfillment of the correlated preconditions specified earlier. In the cases such a function is continuous in effect, a direction of scientific and technological progress contained in an impulse exerted over interval A to B chooses a track of alternating advances in technology and population density potential, which represents a continuous mathematical function in terms of rate of increase of the rate of increase of potential population density. Hence, a value for this function at moment B expresses also an imputed value for C, for D, etc. Now, let us construct an intelligible representation of this continuous function. We do this by refuting the central thesis of Immanuel Kant's critiques, Immanuel Kant 1724 to 1804.
Okay.
That's a lot.
Yes, it is. Any thoughts or questions? I have one little thought in my mind that arose, but anybody have any ideas or thoughts of that they'd like to throw out there based on what we just looked at? Oh shit!
Well, too far back.
Yeah, it's super sensitive to my stupid mouse. Okay. Do we get the idea of deductive logic and why deductive logic and not express a creative act of the human mind? Eureka, have you ever heard of the term deductive logic before?
No.
It's an interesting thing, which it's sort of like if you think of logic, like simple logical leap your mind might make. Like if you might say, okay, all tables have 4 legs as a rule, right? And thus, if it has 4 legs, it must be a table. But then you might see a table with 3 legs, and you'll be like, but that can't be a table because it disobeys my logic.
So basically you'd never come to a discovery because you'd never see that which is not there, or like you'd only see what appears to be there, like relative to what you know.
Yeah, you'll only see those things that fit the formula that your mind has programmed. It's like what we do when we program a computer program. We give it these commands, and it will always follow the command you just put in as a rule. And so deductive logic, which is something that comes out of, that's very much taught in a lot of the philosophy courses in modern Western universities, is deductive logic. It's basically starting with rules that you just assume must be true, but you don't explore them. And then you try to fit all of your data that you can pick up with your senses. You can just pick up data and you collect evidence for whatever, and you call it statistics. And then you try to make sense of the statistics based on these rules that you assume are guiding and controlling these statistics. So he's saying it's fine to use that, but don't assume that expresses what the human mind is. And if you try to do that, you're going to sort of treat human beings, maybe if anything, kind of like an animal ecology, where the animals don't really have technological progress, so their behavior is fixed according to certain rules of genes, instincts, that are just given to them by their breeding, but they're not going to radically alter their behavior over generations. It's really just, so you don't want to assume human beings are like that, or else you'll try to force people to have green energy grids that don't allow them to change.
Could a good example of that be like the way people study psychology, and they kind of put people into different I don't know how to explain it, but you know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying?
I kind of have an idea, but could you say a little bit more?
People into certain groups, and everyone has to fit in these certain groups. But what if you're outside of that and you don't fit in their psychology?
I see what you mean. Yeah, you mean like somebody could say psychologically, oh, you're a type A personality, so you can't do these type B things, or you're a type A personality, so you can't do type A things?
That would be a form of fascism, right?
Well, that leads you in that direction.
Type A or type B.
Huh?
Yeah, and I mean, you've stated it right there, that would essentially be a form of fascism, like a kind of censorship of the creativity of the human mind. So that would be an example.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example.
I think maybe astrology also is a good example of it.
Oh yeah, I can't do that because I'm a Capricorn.
Yeah. So I have to act this way.
Huh?
I have to act this way because I was born in March.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. Good one.
It seems to me also that aside from the fact that it doesn't employ that unique human creative process, that it may or may not necessarily reflect the true universe around us or with which we live. So, if you say something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal, well, that turns out to be true. But if you say, all birds have beaks, and all birds fly, therefore birds have beaks because they fly, that doesn't work.
Yeah, because then how do you account for all of these other birds with beaks but that don't fly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or even Lynn talks about the idea of the hunter and gatherer society. When you study anthropology or that's given to you as like a given. You have to assume that's the starting point for man. Yet you can't prove that it exists or man ever existed like that, because there's no way he could have progressed from there to a more advanced society. So they give you these assumptions which you have to follow and deduce everything else from those assumptions. But then the question is, well, what if the assumption's wrong? Well, then you have to throw everything in the garbage.
But Jerry, let me ask you this. The way I was thinking about it was that hunting and gathering societies probably did exist at some point, but I always thought that there's no evidence of them currently existing, even though we're told we have these natural tribal societies in like the Amazon, and that's their natural state. But the fact is, in the present time, these are current civilizations that probably were, or it seems that the evidence tells us that they were more advanced in the past, and then they fell apart for varieties of reasons and forgot the old technologies that they were using once, and now they appear to be in that primitive state. But,
yeah, degeneration. Yeah.
But but do you think that we've never been in a hunting gathering society at any point in our past? I don't see that as.
Well, you couldn't be there for long because you wouldn't go anywhere.
Yeah,
well, yeah, I mean,
yeah, sure, okay, I agree with that one. Yeah,
like that's really interesting.
For the same thing, they go suddenly. You go from hunter and gatherer to an agricultural-based society. Take that as an example.
Yeah.
Where you could never make that jump. A hunter and gatherer society is stuck being a hunter and gathering society. Or what they would have to do is become what Lynn calls a maritime society. That eating fish and developing travel could actually give your society the free energy as it is to then develop into an agricultural society.
Yeah.
But hunter and gatherer couldn't. He just keep hunting and gathering.
If that was its permanent nature, yeah.
Until there was nothing left to hunt and gather, and then he'd have to move on to another hunting and gathering.
Yeah.
See,
right.
Constantly moving and nothing progresses.
Right.
Yeah. What would you think of like an incremental kind of sedentary movement? So you're nomadic, but as you travel, you'll travel back to kind of same locations, but as things go on, you incrementally kind of increase. So I thought, I just had an idea. I have no evidence or proof of it, but could like ancient societies or hunting and gathering societies theoretically make not farms or like large croplands, but orchards, like apple orchards? Could these societies just kind of have a cyclical rotation and then pick certain spots where they would dedicate more effort into building permanent structures and just kind of like small farms, but more orchards, something that's much more permanent, like fruit trees?
So are you saying that there's like an intermediate? Are you describing this society that's cultivated orchards to be not agricultural and some quasi hunter gatherer? Is that what you're saying? Or I'm
thinking of like an incremental evolution versus a leaping. So is there a theory or any sort of way where a land-based hunting and gathering society could potentially make a sedentary society out of its own ways, or you would have to go towards something like seafaring because it's forcing you to make much greater leaps in your technological evolution?
Well, I think you're. Oh, go on. Yeah, who wants to speak?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you actually look at the evidence, all developments of a culture are beside a river. There's no inland development of society. It's on a river in all cases. But the best way to look at it is in a hunter and gatherer society, 100% of your population is engaged in getting food to survive to the next day. If you compare it to today, we have less than 5% of our population is engaged in agriculture and feeds us, and if we did it right, could feed, 25 million people. So if you're in a hunter and gatherer society where 100% is engaged in food, what do you do to change that culture so that, say, only 90% of your population is engaged in hunting and gathering for food, in which you freed up 10% of the population, which can actually do something else?
Like think about what they could do.
That's how you make a change. So how do you change a hunter and gatherer society to be able to free up that 10%
Yeah.
of the population, what they call surplus, to do something else, to figure out how to plant orchards? So you'll find with a maritime culture, you could do that where you wouldn't have to have 100% of your population engaged in food production. That's why it's by a river.
Is that just because of a yield in food? Because just fishing supplies a greater yield in food than hunting?
Yeah, than hunting and gathering by far, yeah.
So,
and also you soon develop transportation along the river.
Yeah, because I was also thinking that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to invent boats. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to invent transportation on the water, free to move. Because you can still have a gathering society along a shoreline.
Yeah.
You can fish from the shoreline and gather crustaceans and stuff that build up along the shoreline, but I still don't see that meaning that it's going, there's a guarantee you're going to go out into the seas and oceans.
Yeah.
You're going to get away, like going inland, going further out into the water gets similarly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's my thought in all of this is that when you're looking at these two variables of population, the actual population and the potential population, you'll find that I think if you stick with a certain way of doing things and a certain knowledge that's not changing of reality and technology that's not changing, you're going to have a certain limitation of your potential. So let's say you have 8,000 of your village, 8,000 people. Your potential might be 10,000 based on a certain set of level of knowledge. But if you make a new discovery, all of a sudden somebody discovers how to use fire, then you might not have 20,000 people next year. You might only have 9,000 people. That it might grow kind of incrementally, but your potential, as soon as you discovered the fire and you've communicated that to others how to use it, how does that potential population change day to day? I think that would literally change in a quantum leap, going from 10,000 potential to probably 25, 30,000 potential. But even though you didn't see a physical change that's all that drastic right away. So I think that's the quantum leap aspect that you'll have as a discrete leap versus the continuous leap, Or if you forget something, you had a knowledge of something and then all of a sudden, bam, you forgot it. It's been wiped out or whatever, suppressed. Bam, that potential collapses below your actual real population level. And then what happens? You start cannibalizing each other, right? You go all Aztec.
I think that was a big problem because the average life expectancy was, say, 20 years. So
yeah. Yeah, that's. So let's go on. I noticed that there's a paragraph we didn't actually read on Immanuel Kant. I think that was my mistake. Jerry, can you read the next?
Yeah. Okay. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, German exponent of British liberalism. What we shall now refute is Kant's false conceit on the subject of the possibility of intelligible representation of those forms of creative mental activity expressed by a valid fundamental discovery in mathematical physics. Kant's neo-Aristotelian theorem has the perverse relative merit of being the most exhaustively rigorous among the modern proponents of the same opinion on this point. Example, Francis Bacon, Hobbes, Galileo, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Laplace, Cauchy, Kelvin, Maxwell, Kronecker, B. Russell et al. So if we refute Kant's dogma on this point, we also expose the falseness, the absurdity of the anti-Platonic dogmas generally.
Cool. Then we got a picture of Francis Bacon, the author of The New Atlantis. For those listening and not watching this, we got a picture of Thomas Hobbes, author of Leviathan, a picture of René Descartes, who described the universe as mechanistic, a picture of John Locke, a picture of David Hume, who asserted man's bestial nature, a picture of James Clerk Maxwell, the scientist, Royal Society hoaxer, and finally a picture of Lord Bertrand Russell, who wished for Black Death in every generation. That's from his quote from this was it? The Impact of Science on Society. And the text continues. Jerry, go for it.
The central feature of Kant's fallacious dogma, like that of his most important predecessor in this view, Descartes, 1596 to 1650, is the dogma's blind faith in deductive logic. As we shall show, deductive logic, the root of today's accepted classroom mathematics, is incapable of permitting its user to construct an intelligible representation of a true nonlinear function. Therefore, deductive logic and any mathematics enslaved to its formalism is incapable of comprehension of any truly elementary functions of the physical universe. To the immediate point, Kant's relative merit was that he recognized the existence of valid fundamental discoveries in physics. However, insofar as he recognized this phenomenon, he also recognized that the process by which such discoveries are generated in the human mind cannot itself be supplied an intelligible representation within the scope of deductive method. Deductive method says that creative mental processes have no valid existence in our universe. The best deduction can do is to recognize that such phenomena do exist. We shall now summarize the relevant kernel of Kant's argument from a modern standpoint. Any ideal system of deductive logic begins with a set of axioms and postulates. Axioms are theorems adopted without proof, so adopted on the basis of the assertion that their truth is self-evident. Postulates are theorems adopted with no other proof than the indication that such assumptions must be added to the set of axioms for the purpose of eliminating arbitrarily ambiguities in the system derived from a combined set of axioms and postulates. A first layer of theorems is derived from an initial set of axioms and postulates. In turn, a second layer of theorems is derived from the combination of the first layer of theorems plus the original set of axioms and postulates. So the edifice of theorems grows layer by layer upon the foundation of the initial axioms and postulates. The result is known as a deductive theorem lattice. Every possible theorem in this lattice is deductively consistent with each and all of the underlying set of axioms and postulates. The corollary is no theorem of a truly consistent deductive theorem lattice claims anything which was not already claimed implicitly by the underlying set of axioms and postulates. This latter property is known as the hereditary property of all consistent deductive theorem lattices. Against that background, consider the implications of a single valid, crucial physical experiment which disproves a single theorem of a body of mathematical physics dogma. A formal deductive form of mathematics dominates the classroom and mathematical physics today. Although in practice, no body of taught mathematical physics is as consistent as the deductive hereditary principle implies it ought to become. It is the implicit intent of formalist mathematical physics teaching and practice that such perfect consistency ought to prevail. In that degree, with such qualification, the overwhelming majority of mathematical physics teaching today is, at its least worst, Kantian. In that sense, that body of current practice is obliged to meet any standard of proof of consistency implicit in the Kantian deductive method. If a single crucial physical experiment shows any strongly defended present theorem of a school of mathematical physics to be wrong, this physical evidence implies, by virtue of the deductive hereditary principle, that the entire set of axioms and postulates upon which the entirety of that mathematical physics rests is in error. In practice, when presented with such crucial experimental evidence, we must not plunge immediately to the assumption that the hereditary principle applies with such seismic force. No existing mathematical physics dogma, except perhaps some very obscure abstract ones, is deductively consistent. That inconsistency, as it bears upon any popular theorem, must be examined first, before proceeding boldly toward scientific revolutionary conclusions. Assume we have taken all of the applied precautions. Assume therefore that we have a proven case, a crucial experiment which disproves at least one among the assumptions embedded in the underlying set of axioms and postulates. In that case, the following steps of correction are implicit, using computer language. 1. The flawed axiomatic assumption is replaced by means of a relevant hypothesis. 2. The entirety of the existing theorem lattice is revised, as if theorem by theorem, to reflect this change in the hereditary basis. 3. Each and all of the revised theorems are subjected to an appropriate crucial experiment, at least implicitly so. For if this does not yield a valid result, a new corrective hypothesis is required and the process repeated. 5. If the reconstruction is successful by standard of crucial experiment, the corresponding scientific revolution may be considered a success. Such a scientific revolution is used now as typifying those kinds of transformations, as from A to B, associated with the causal impact of scientific and technological progress relative to a resulting increase of potential population density. Define Kant's error from the illustrative standpoint just outlined. Assume a series of such scientific technological transformations of a society. A to B, B to C, C to D, D to etc. Let each such transformation be defined axiomatically by a crucial experimental case of the type illustrated. In this representation, A, B, C, D, etc. are defined as in the hypothetical case of the swimmer above. Permit the following ruse. Assume that each of the moments, A, B, C, D, etc., corresponds to a specific set of formal deductive axioms and postulates, such that no set associated with any one term of that series is deductively consistent with the set associated with any other among the designated moments. The arrangement chosen for this ruse will fail us. That failure is our proximate goal. We shall learn more from experiencing the failure than had we not hazarded it. Assume that the set of axioms and postulates attributed in each case is in some form of correspondence to the level of science technology, state of the art at that moment. That science technology level might be represented formally in a different way than the correlated choice of set of axioms and postulates, or not. We assume only that the chosen set maps the actual level of practice as well as is possible from the standpoint of deductive theorem lattices. The event which is of interest to us is the occurrence of a crucial experimental transformation which compels us to replace the set of axioms and postulates A sub 0 by A sub 1, A sub 1 by A sub 2, and so forth. For our purpose, let us choose A, B, C, D, etc., such that A to B represents an interval during which A sub 0 is implicitly replaced by A sub 1, and so forth, and so on. Hence, A equals the set A sub 0, B equals A sub 1, C equals A sub 2, and so on.
Oops, went too far.
Oh, okay.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Yeah, okay. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
The event, which becomes the elementary subject variable term of our historically continuous function, is the process of transformation depicted by the arrow linking each pair of successive terms, moments. Let us then compare A sub 0 and A sub 1. By this means, let us seek to define the nature of the event upon which the notion of this continuous function depends. No theorem of theorem lattice A is consistent with any theorem of theorem lattice B. There is no deductive continuity between the two lattices. Between the two, there is a logical gulf, a chasm which no deductive method might bridge. In the language of formal mathematics, commonplace classroom mathematics, that logical gulf is known as a simple mathematical discontinuity. This continuity is the substance, example, the matter, material substance, of that action, which defines that continuous function, whose intelligible representation we are constructing, the rate of increase of potential population density. This function, as it is key to defining successful survival, is indispensable in turn for constructing a true definition of common sense. Whew, that's a lot.
Yes, it
God, it's so dense, that part.
is. That's, I think, one of the densest chapters. There's a lot to sink into there. Does anybody have, straight up, just right off the bat, any particular question about some element or some term he brought up or some idea that you find confusing, or some thought that inspired your mind to think of an example of what he's saying about these hereditary systems or deductive theorem lattices or anything like that?
I have two questions.
Okay, but Kim, we can hear you, but it's faint. Is there any way for you to get closer to your mic, or no?
I have to get a set of headphones. Okay, how about if I talk like that? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's better.
I'll get headphones right after this. So I have two questions. Can you go to the previous page?
Here?
Where he says the second to last paragraph at the end, he says, no existing mathematical physics dogma, excepting perhaps some very obscure abstract ones, is deductively consistent. So I was surprised that he said except perhaps some very obscure abstract ones.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what he was referring to. I couldn't think of an example of what those might be.
Okay, and then go to the next page. When he uses the very top paragraph there, he says, in that case, the following steps of correction are implicit using computer language. What does he mean by computer language?
Oh, I just think he means these 5 statements that he makes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
Could be stated very logically by a computer, descriptively. That's what I was thinking descriptive language. Like if you discover a problem in of one of the underlying assumptions in your theorem lattice, then and you discover that it's how does he describe it? You set up a crucial experiment which disproves at least one among the assumptions, right? The root assumptions. So if you have a tree and these branches that represent your theorem lattice, right? And each branch represents if this, thus this, and it can go on with many infinite branches, right, in your tree. But the root core assumption that you didn't explore, if you prove that there's something wrong in the root, then you have to reevaluate you have to see how that wrongness poisons all of the branches throughout the tree. But if you discover that is wrong, he says these 5 things you could then say have to happen. But it doesn't mean he's not saying how the change is happening. He's just then you have to, if flawed axiomatic assumptions is replaced by means of a relevant hypothesis. Yeah, right. So you have to replace with a better hypothesis for the root. And then number 2, the entirety of the existing theorem lattice is revised as if theorem by theorem to reflect this change of the hereditary basis. Number 3, each and all of the revised theorems are subjected to an appropriate crucial experiment. So then, yeah, you have to figure out ways of possibly testing with a specific type of experiment the validity of these other theorems. And then you have to also, if this does not yield a valid result, a new corrective hypothesis is required. So then, yeah, if that corrected hypothesis itself fails a crucial experiment, you can't just stay in your ivory tower. You got to get your hands dirty and test it out in reality. If that still fails, then you have to go back again to the drawing board and find a better hypothesis. And finally, 5, if the reconstruction is successful by standard of crucial experiment, so now you've got a better thought, you've tested it out with an experiment, and both validate, the experiment validates your thought, then the corresponding scientific revolution may be considered a success. Your whole tree now has a completely different, more potent, it's a totally different thing now, that theorem lattice.
Thank you.
Now, the challenge for all of us is to think of examples where that happens, whether in medical science or in astronomy or whatever, like, when has that happened? What does it look like? And I'm not saying do that right now on the spot. I'm just saying for those listening at home and for those of us here, maybe even just take a little note. When can I think of examples where this sort of thing happens, and what does it look like?
I mean, we see it in art a lot.
Go on.
Must I? Well, you see it in painting, like, sorry, I'm eating, but, well, around the Golden Renaissance, you see a complete change in the way paintings are made.
What caused that change from the feudal medieval paintings to the Renaissance paintings? What's that change to happen?
Well, are you talking culturally, or like, are you talking about the specific person who brought about that change?
Not the name of the person necessarily, but you're saying that there's a change. How would you describe the change from Renaissance paintings to what came before it of medieval paintings?
Well, the use of light and shade and the ability to create 3D or what are termed to be like 3-dimensional paintings, where you would have, we went from very flat images where the forms on the painting didn't appear real or even realistic to the eye, so they didn't appear like the person in the room. And then we discovered a way of using, instead of drawing lines to outline form, to use contouring and like shading of that form to bring the form into a more realistic image. So I don't know if I described that well, but like, yeah.
I think you did. So you probably want to add perspective, right? The discovery of 1, 2, and 3-point perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you have the golden section and things like that too, where Da Vinci, yeah, he picks a point at the very back of the painting, that the center of your eye is naturally drawn to, but then between that point and the edges of the frame of that image,
yeah,
you have a kind of process of like kind of a path of other images that bring that image into like a 3D perspective, where you're almost looking into an image rather than at an image which is flat in front of your face. You're almost looking into a...
I like that. Yeah. So if you were a painter,
like a scene on a stage, it's the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
In theaters, that's why we made theaters the way they are today, based on the same idea as like a frame of a painting.
Yeah.
The way the curtains are on the side and everything is and the golden frame around most theaters that were built back in the Renaissance period are based on the same principles as a frame of a painting, and how you create a scene or something which is almost active happening in front of your eyes, although it is not active.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, right. So if you were to have a Platonic dialogue with a painter from the 13th century, and you were to ask them about what is painting and why is painting and what can it do, they would not have the same answers as a painter who was a student of Da Vinci a couple hundred years later.
No.
Because their minds are being informed by a totally different set of discoveries that they're being now trained to utilize, right?
Yeah, or even someone like David Hockney today, who would also not be able to have that kind of conversation, probably.
Who? David who?
David Hockney.
I don't know who that is.
Oh, well, that's good, because he's not useful. He's rubbish. But he's just as bad as those Dark Age painters. So yeah, he doesn't understand Renaissance painting. He doesn't understand any of that stuff. And if he does, he's chosen to ignore it and get paid a lot of money to do what he does. So, yeah.
I'll Google his name.
Yeah, I'm surprised. He's like up on Jackson Pollard,
Oh,
kind of. Yeah. He's actually David Hockney is definitely tied to people like Kissinger and the Atlantic, or is it the Atlantic Council?
Okay, I'm fascinated.
Yeah, he's been totally funded. Totally, like he's a high-level art operative in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, it's a good example, though. Very good example. Any other thoughts or questions before we proceed?
I just wanted to ask one thing. Has anyone, LaRouche is talking about Immanuel Kant, and I just had a question. Has anyone actually read Kant's books? Because I haven't. I mean, I tried. I might get like the first chapter and I just give up. You'd have to have a shotgun to my head to get me to read anymore. I just couldn't do it. Oh, I found it so dry.
I found it very dry. I got maybe a couple hundred pages into Critique on Judgment once, and it was so dry. And I was reading pages and not thinking. I was like, Juan though might have.
Yes, well, I would like to offer a very short summary of the two major works of Kant. It's not very complicated, because La critique de la raison pure, the critique of the pure reason, would simply offer a kind of deductive system to describe the human mind. Okay? So the major concept of La critique de la raison pure is de l'entendre, the categories of human mind, if you want. And it would offer a kind of tree, precisely, as Bob said last time, of logical language. That's for Critique de la raison pure. And Critique de la raison pratique, critiques of practical reason, it's that we need to have a moral conduct because it is so. Okay, it's as simple as that. There's no levels of awareness that is implied in that, and it's explained most of the time by the fact that Kant was a religious person and has been influenced very much by his mother, who was very pious. So the final conclusion for Critique de la raison pratique is that human beings need to be moral because they need to be moral, and that's all. Because duty is superior to reason. I think that the shortest way to understand that is that duty is superior to reason.
Really?
Kant is like a modern Spartan, isn't he?
Yes, to a certain extent, I think that we can take that comparison. And let's not forget that he wrote the first book to Critique de la raison pure to justify the idea of an independent space-time according to Newton. That's it was the reason why he decided to write the Critique de la raison pure.
Is that true? Is he actually explicit about that intention?
Yes, it's in the first 10% of the book.
I totally blanked that out. Okay, that's interesting.
You've actually read it then?
Yes.
Critique. What was the point you made, Juan, about Newton?
About?
He basically just said that Kant makes explicit in the critique of reason, reason or judgment?
Well, judgment is the English translation. Okay, the
Critique of
English
reason.
translation would use, yeah. So French is critique de la raison pure, and in English would be critique of pure judgment. But sometimes the translation also gives critique of pure reason too.
Yeah. And Quan was just saying that Kant makes explicit that he was doing this in order to isolate, as you said, space from time.
Well, no, it was in order to promote the idea from Isaac Newton that space is absolute entity independent of energy and matter, and time is an absolute entity independent of energy and matter.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, because people often treat this as a purely moral philosophical work, and they don't think of it as having any scientific physics association.
Yeah, and I would like to introduce maybe the expression representation of the world, okay? Because what Lyndon LaRouche said that the function is indispensable for constructing a true definition of common sense, and common sense takes its roots from a certain representation of the world. That representation can be unconscious, subconscious, or conscious. And reality of life is most of the time understood by paradoxes. And paradoxes precisely the opposite of the rigid deductive system. And that's why moral philosophy is never isolated by itself, but is always connected to a certain representation of the world. I would like to remind you that the ancient Greek philosopher, they always begins by their understanding of what is the physical world, and after their logical representation of that world, and after that their epistemology, and after that at the end they would offer their moral perspectives.
Which is, I think, why as well, even in Plato, there's the point in the Republic that one should first master the laws of geometry and arithmetic, and then go on to astronomy and music before one gets to moral dialectic and philosophy. That comes at the end, after you've developed an instinct for how the mind works, exploring the physics of the world you live in and we're created into. And then you can use that infrastructure you've created to go into moral philosophizing and statecraft and things of a higher nature. But don't just jump into that with no foundation.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I'm a lover of Plato, so I would like to remind once again, and I'm sorry to be a parrot in this group for Plato, but I want to remind the 4 steps: acacia, the shadows, the sense perception; pistis, conventional truth; psychology, let's say, in modern terms; after that, dianoia, mathematical notions; and finally, eidos, where you have access to the world of morality and of high philosophy, if you want.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we're going to be reading some Plato after we get through this book. That's very good. Okay, so it's now 9:34. We have time for, I think, one more chapter before we close it off for tonight. Wait a minute. Where are we at? Yeah, chapter 4. So, Quan, do you want to read chapter 4?
Okay, why not? Okay, I think that with my new booster, it should be okay. There should not be choppy audio, but if it happened, just stop me.
I was going to say, actually, your voice already sounds clearer. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I suppose that we should be okay for the next 10 minutes. Okay, let's start.
Okay.
Okay, chapter 4, continuous transformation. This action is the transformation of lattice A into lattice B and so on. So we are obliged to represent the matter from a viewpoint of deductive lattice theory. All valid, fundamental, crucial experimental discovery in physical science, for example, is of this form, at least as this form is to be recognized from that deductive standpoint. This action, even if considered only abstractly by itself, is a quality which sets mankind absolutely apart from and absolutely above the beasts. Consider once again the process phase so abstracted in terms of these steps. Step 1. Scientific and technological progress affected by generation of the indicated discontinuity causes an increase in society's per capita power over nature as a whole, an effect which is expressed by an increase in potential population density. Step 2. So, a mental activity per se, creative thought, is a powerful physical cause of a physical effect. Step 3. The transformation of knowledge and practice caused by scientific and technological progresses, upward transformation of potential population density. Now, conditions causally a new upward surge in generation, transmission, and efficient assimilation of scientific and technological progress. Step 4. This, in turn, generates implicitly a further increase of potential population density, and so on. If we had traced that sequence of cause and effect only as far as completion of second of the foregoing steps, meaning mental activity per se, it would appear that result of scientific and technological progress were merely momentary survival. If we continue through the third and fourth step, the third being transformation of knowledge and practice, and fourth generates implicitly a further increase of potential population density, we show a complete cycle in which the result is measured in terms of the concept successful survival. In contrast to the relatively fixed range of potential relative population density of each species and varieties, in which the range of adaptive variation appears to be as if fixed by instinct, man transforms his species instinct at will. Although our species cannot change its instincts arbitrarily, societies can accomplish such an effect along lawful pathways by lawful means. What we have considered on this account thus far indicates that any moment A we may choose implicitly among a number of different journeys into the future. So we have moment A to B1 to C1 to D1 as one possibility, but you also have alternative pathways to that first line of journey, if you want.
Yes.
Also, any among the B's, C's, D's, and so forth in that array of any choice of series may become a new starting point, A, after which any among a number of B's might determine a branching new pathway into the future. This signifies that we are viewing the transformation from A onward B as relatively crucial, and that we are viewing this transformation in the light of the four-step cycle, implicitly defining an action of successful survival. It is the causal conditioning of the transformation, B onward C, by the effect of transformation, A onward B, which defines implicitly the quality of continuing, hence continuous transformation, which we are examining. Such functions cannot be comprehended by any mathematical physics, which is consistent with principles of any deductive logic. We summarize the case in terms of the relevant facts noted up to this point. The action which expresses the transformation of lattice A into lattice B is located uniquely in the mathematical discontinuity separating the domain of lattice B absolutely from the deductive domain of lattice A. That discontinuity is the division which defines the exact discreteness of B with respect to A. Yet, that action which is the transformation cannot be represented intelligibly in any form of deductive logic.
Okay, do people generally think that important idea?
Yes.
Yeah, because we're looking.
And yes.
Go on.
Go, Matthew. Okay. Yes, I think that you're right to stop here because that's the nexus of the problem. But I would let you explain that.
The first time I looked at this, I had a difficulty thinking about this point A to point B1 to C1 to D1 and alternative pathways of A to B2 to C2 to D2 or B3 to C3 to D3. It was difficult until I realized that he already helped several chapters ago when he gave the concrete example of, think of Athens 599 BC and the population density then, and then think of Charlemagne's Europe, you know, France in the 8th century, think of France in the 15th century, and then think of, you know, this other example of America in 1890. And then he's like, okay, those are concrete examples of systems. So you're thinking not of these letters as being like a thing, but as a system, similar to what he just described. And it could have gone other ways, right? Like we could have taken so many other pathways than the one that was chosen, that people chose to take in the history that we're living in. But if you go
absolutely.
So yeah, like going into the future at each of these points of change were always underdetermined. It could have gone. People living in those times could have done a variety of things to create different things. Just like us, you know, you could introduce whether we, you know, if you chose to introduce a policy of committing to working with China and Russia on developing a lunar colony and a Mars exploration system, or if you choose instead to, you know, to do something else. Like, let's
but I would like to give an example, Matthew.
Yeah, sure, of course.
If FDR did die on April 12, 1945, and let's say he died a year later, or even 6 months later, we would be in another world completely.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point.
Or if Kennedy hadn't gotten shot and all the anomalies that happened, or so-called anomalies that happened on that day, also.
Yeah, exactly. But I chose FDR because he lived 20 years before Kennedy. So
No, yeah, of course. Go ahead. I love it. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I would never make them compete. Like, no.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's it. So like we could have had feasibly already, 18, 19 billion people at a higher quality of life than anything imaginable.
Could have been on Mars.
Yeah, we could have had our first colony on Mars by like 1983, if things were not disrupted. So yeah, we've got these changes, but it's the thing in between that he's saying, right? Because you could take a snapshot of these different moments in time and evaluate the system of the USA in 1944, in 1963, in 2017, and you'll have all of these different parameters of the system of changing, potential population will all be different based on the fact that we have, in some cases, new technologies and better practices. And in some cases, we've lost technologies and we've lost certain practices that we were once able to do, right? So things are changing in one direction, for better or for worse, but it's the thing in between when you have a new idea introduced into the system, and you could measure it as a thing, as a snapshot, but it's what happens in between these moments of change. That's not representable in that way. So Immanuel Kant can simply describe that these things happen, but he's not able to describe what allows that eureka, those leaps, happen in between.
Yeah, exactly.
And that happens in science as well, like with the same kind of Aristotelian thinkers. They can't explain why something is happening, just what. They can see it and they can lay it out in terms, but they can't actually explain the process, the action.
Yeah. I think there is a hierarchy between different branches of philosophy. Logic is a minor branch for me. Epistemology is a bigger branch of philosophy.
So I suppose with this kind of diagram here, like you can replace that with like something like the internet per se, like A being dial-up, like the very first origin of the World Wide Web. And then, you could go through the different rates of internet, but you would never, to create a new form of communication other than the internet, it cannot follow the same axioms as what the internet does. And so at any of the points of BC, 3G, 4G, 5G, 6G, and maybe one of those points could, start as a new A, like if it would build a new hypothesis, but all the time it follows the same axioms and postulates, it wouldn't actually be a new creative discovery. Is that relative to, in technological terms?
Sounds good. Yeah, like I think that there's certain modifications and improvements you could get with 3G dial-up internet, but it's limited, it's bounded. And there's a set of discoveries and improvements you can't make unless you create a completely new framework that involved 4G to go online. And then you have a new space to move in that was unavailable to you with the previous set.
Because I was thinking, like, when this Perseverance Mars rover landed, there was this 7 minutes of terror where, because the distance and the time taken for a message to travel from Mars to Earth, there's this period where they knew before going that due to the limited amount of connectivity, the rover would have to perform autonomously. So to overcome a problem such as that, which in the future we will have to, if we're going to inhabit Mars, if we want to message our family on Mars per se, we'd have to go a lot. We'd have to build an entirely new hypothesis as how telecommunications works. Like, it'd be a new branch of technology other than the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly.
Yeah, and since gravity is like a third weaker on Mars, you'd have to have new rules for basketball as well.
Yeah, you couldn't have like athletes from Mars competing with Earthlings, could you?
Well, yeah, they definitely have to create some handicaps there. Yeah, that won't work.
Like a galactic Olympics. How would that work?
Yeah, it's a fun experiment.
Yeah, you can go all sorts. Yeah, I mean, your mind really travels with just this simple abstract idea like this. Cool.
Yeah, maybe we'll find new colors, be able to paint new paintings. Like that.
That's a concept I never thought of before. Is that even a possibility? I don't know, Evan.
I don't know. If there's any place to find a new color, it's not on Earth.
A new color. I got to think about that. I don't know if is it possible that we know all possible colors? I mean, certainly, I guess we know of the colors that our eyes evolve into.
There's an infinite number of colors.
Yeah, it's light spectrum.
The light spectrum is infinite. Yeah, human beings only see 3 colors. Birds see 4.
Yeah.
So essentially, then we're limited, but then we could potentially create a pair of glasses that would help us see.
That's what I'm thinking.
Well, human beings born in space on another world may change a little bit. Who knows how they're going to change?
Yeah, right. How if in 1,000 years of a civilization being existing on Mars, how would their ears potentially change? Like what frequencies would they maybe pick up that we don't? Or yeah, that's a good question. How would their bones change?
We know astronauts they get taller while they're in space.
Yeah.
The ones who are on the ISS. Things like that.
Well, I think we're getting these are all very fascinating questions we're thinking about. I think we are getting a little bit off of topic, but yeah, this is all fascinating stuff. Okay, let's get back on because how many more pages do we have for this chapter?
3, 2.5, 3.
Okay, yeah, let's read those.
Okay. So continuing, to ensure that what should be obvious is obvious, we add this. To be comprehended in any deductive schema, the chosen object must be defined in the form of a consistent theorem of a deductive theorem lattice. By definition, by construction, there exists no possible deductive theorem lattice which could subsume the discontinuity as a consistent theorem statement, except to assert, as did Kant, that discontinuity's deductive incomprehensibility. It is the central feature of Kant's critiques that the kind of creative processes which generate valid fundamental discoveries in physical science are intrinsically incomprehensible as processes. He shows that this is true for all deductive analysis and denies the existence of any mode of constructing intelligible representations but deduction. In the first line of argument to this effect, he conceded the fact of creative discoveries odds. He recognized such discovery in the physical sciences as a rationally comprehensible fact, but only after the fact of its occurrence, a posteriori. Therefore, he would concede the occurrence of lattice B, a posteriori, as the successor to A. He would be self-obliged to recognize B as analytically distinct from A. Similarly, he would be self-obliged to concede the viewpoint of deductive lattice theory that B is everywhere inconsistent deductively with A. Similarly, the Kantian method would be obliged to concede the existence of a discontinuity as the characteristic of that transformation which generated B of A. However, although the Kantian method can recognize the existence of the discontinuity as such, it can recognize it only as a bottomless chasm in the expanses of deductive logical space, a chasm which one may not bridge, but merely leap if one were able to do so. Kantian method could not construct an intelligible representation of that apparent chasm. Put the latter point in another frame of reference. At most, deductive analysis may recognize the existence of the discontinuity as to form, but not as to substance. It may recognize existence of the discontinuity in the sense one recognizes a line of indefinite length as separating two general areas of a plane surface, or a surface as enclosing a volume of space, as preventing the space from within from finding any continuity with the volume of space without. To the degree deduction limits the notion of matter to discrete, singularity bounded particles in empty space and empty time, it cannot tolerate the attribution of the qualities of matter, accepting the quality of discreteness, form itself, to a discontinuity. Axiomatically, analysis recognizes points, lines, surfaces, solids, and hypersolids as singularities, and recognizes that discontinuity is an essential property of singularity. Yet, axiomatically, ponderability is not allowed for the point, line, or surface itself, etc. Yet, as we have indicated, the singularity signed by the discontinuity of A onward B is the efficient action by means of which lattice A is transformed into lattice B. That transformation, so depicted, is but the deductive sign for the action of scientific technological progress. The effect of this action as cause is an increase of the potential population density of society. The latter is a very ponderable effect. Scientific and technological progress is a very ponderable force. The transformation which generates the force of progress is a physically efficient force. From this point, everything which follows hangs upon our understanding of the kind of mathematical discontinuity we have identified. We must resolve step by step the difficult questions bearing upon the nature of its existence and of the possibility of the intelligible representation of that existence. A discontinuity might be something which has no existence, as we think ordinarily of existence. For example, the idea that two objects differ is not itself an existence. Similarly, the mere idea that a finite object ceases in extent at the outer limit of its finiteness is not a distinct existence. To attribute existence to such objects is like saying, I'm taking my not wife out for a walk so that I may walk alone. Such sentences make good sense to a truly thorough logician, but not to a person with true common sense. However, if a limit has a distinct form, that form represents a kind of existence for that limit. This form may be negative in the sense of an externally imposed limitation, or positive as a self-generated limit. Then there is the notion of material existence. It would be absurd to attribute the quality of matter any express property, but efficient causal agency. That suggests that since the discontinuity causes the transformation of lattice A into B, the discontinuity is an efficient agency and therefore material. Before we can do much with these observations on the subject of existence, we must address a second stratum of question. When we refer here to a distinct form, we are begging a question. How do we define that form as distinct? Our ideas about distinct forms falls into two subclasses. The first subclass is those forms which we can replicate by use of a coherent principle of construction. That construction of an observer form is an intelligible representation of that form. Distinctness demonstrated by means of such intelligible representation generates one general subclass of distinct forms. The second subclass of distinct forms comprises those instances which appear to define an adequate form of such intelligible representation. Bernard Riemann, 1826 to 1866, has referred to such form expressing an arbitrary function. However, forms of the second...
I'll just read footnote 2 there. It is
implicitly
the case that any form corresponding to a process existing in the universe is ultimately susceptible of intelligible representation until a form is rendered intelligible by means of specification for construction of such a representation. The form is classed as apparently arbitrary. Okay. So to assume that if something exists, it must be made intelligible in some way before you, and until you figure out how to do that, because you might not know how to do that, you have to say it's apparently arbitrary, but not absolutely arbitrary. You have to assume that it's discoverable. You can discover how to represent it. Most people will just stop short and say, because I don't know how to represent it, I just assume it's naturally unknowable or naturally intrinsically arbitrary, and don't even stop thinking about it.
I see. I have to admit that this Lyndon LaRouche is an impressive philosopher. Okay, so we read the last page.
There's one thing that I think caught my mind that I just wanted to say, just to keep people on track, because I know it's easy to fall off sometimes when reading through some of the dense language that you're encountering.
Especially if you're tired.
Yeah,
it is, no doubt. But I think the key point that there's this. Every chapter, he's getting at the same theme. We're trying to chase a critter. The critter is not something that's intelligible, but it's something that most people deny exists because they can't express it, because itself is the thing that causes the change to happen. So what is that thing in between lattice A and lattice B, or system A and system B, or the state that Plato talks about when he's always talking about how you were ignorant and then you had knowledge. What allowed that change in between? And he's saying, you know, if you were to be an empiricist and you're just like descriptively trying to say, I'm going to assume reality is what I can describe, then I'm looking at lattice A and I'm looking at lattice B, and I'm seeing that reality, all of reality of what I can know is in A and it's in B. But the thing that causes, that's in between A and B, that allows for the change, it's not A and it's not B. So what is it, right? It's neither, it's not all of this and it's not all of this, but you can't just say it's negation. Otherwise, you know, you're into that problem of I'm taking my non-wife out for a non-walk.
It's the Holy Spirit.
Well, you know, I don't like giving it a label, but yeah, sure. Why not?
People have tried.
A what?
People have tried.
Yeah. I mean, as soon as you give it a name, though, people, it locks people's mind into
Yeah. No, of course.
Anyway, yeah, it's definitely. So that's always what we're doing. What he's always doing is try to narrow in. How do you understand this critter that allows for all of the change in human economies and the universe as a whole? This in-betweenness. Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there just to maybe help.
No, it's great. It actually stimulated a lot of thoughts.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that we need to discuss from time to time to elucidate a certain mysteries.
Exactly.
Okay, continuing.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, however, forms of the second class, the arbitrary functions, are implicitly comprehensible nonetheless. If we attempt to replicate them by construction, we create intelligible representations which can be termed near misses. The difference between such a near miss and the apparently arbitrary curve can be quantified as a distinct number of singularities, discontinuities, of each of an observed assortment of classes. This latter supplemental sort of intelligibility of margins of difference is a special kind of intelligible representation sufficient to facilitate recognition. In the case that the apparently arbitrary form is found in the universe apart from our own conjectures, we know that sooner or later an intelligible representation will be constructed. The second aspect of existence is that we associate with matter substance. It is the issue of the hypothetical substantiality of the discontinuities or singularities in transformation functions implicit in A onward B and B onward C and so on, which bears in a most crucial way on the strict definition of successful survival and hence of true common sense. We turn to that issue of substantiality next. End of chapter.
Very good. Very good reading.
Thanks.
Cool. The next chapter is called, just as a little teaser, Circular Action and Maximum Minimum. So that will be next week's starting point.
Just in the end there, when he says, like, in the case that the apparently arbitrary form is found in the universe apart from our own conjectures, we know that sooner or later an intelligible representation will be constructed. I mean, is he getting at, like, a kind of destiny, and not I don't want to throw labels again, but like the the idea of God and humans born in the image of God and all that he thinks that, well, it will always be evident in us. It will always be active in us. This
No, I don't think he means that here. I think what he's talking about deals more with maybe what many human beings have tended over the years to call miracles.
Right. Okay.
There's phenomenon which appears to be unexplicable, and they will say, thus the universe is magical and unknowable, and it's divine intervention or something, you know?
So like a mirage before they understood it.
A mirage, or they'll attribute it to like something supernatural, rather than assuming that it's natural, but we just haven't discovered the forces of nature that would account for the thing which appears to be supernatural.
Yeah.
And people will you often leap and just say, thus the universe is intrinsically magical and unknowable, because there are these phenomenon that are not explicable by the current science that I'm using, And he's saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Just assume your science is the problem that needs to be perfected. Don't assume that the universe is irrational and you should just hold on to your science.
that it's just random hoo-ha.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you have to have that faith, right? He's saying that it's
right. Yeah.
There's a sense that the universe is ultimately intelligible. That's an article of faith. It's not something you can prove logically it's true necessarily, because there's always more you don't know.
Okay.
Forever.
Mm-hmm. The acceptance of ignorance. That's Kuso.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's optimistic.
Definitely an optimist, yeah. Any other parting thoughts or questions or anything before we round it out? What I'll do, I'm going to send out to everybody the Power of Labor lecture documentary that he made in 1985 I referenced earlier. I'm going to make sure that this goes in the description box of this video on YouTube, and I'm going to email it to everybody ASAP, which would be good if people can watch that before we meet up again next week. It's really golden, really, really good little lesson with a lot of these concepts sort of dealt with from LaRouche's own voice, which is nice to just listen to and just see how his mind actually develops ideas vocally, because it's obviously very similar to what we're reading here, but so I'll just do that.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, guys. So just so you guys all know, this Sunday is Harrison Quayle from SOT's Mind Matters program, who's going to be doing a class on panpsychism, some monadology, and ponerology. So that'll be this Sunday at 4. Yeah, if you know people who like ideas, feel free to extend the invitation. The Zoom link will be sent out, so you can invite more people if you know friends who would like this.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.